Let's make history. Had a angry, disgruntled viewer who made an entire video about a video that I did concerning Fat Joe and this whole debate about Puerto Ricans' involvement in hip-hop. Check that video out as soon as you can. So I'm going to give a brief history of the 5% Nation here, and then on the tail end I'm going to address the comments that she made in the video. So first off, it's not the 5% Nation, but I titled it that because that's how people most know them by. They're called 5%ers. But the technical name is now the Nation of Gods and Earths. It's almost impossible to tell when Islam first actually came to America, because you have to think. First off, we do know that it came through Africans, and this is before the slave trade. So there are certain places on the west coast of Africa where in the water, in the Atlantic Ocean, there are currents. And long ago, Africans learned that if they just got in their boats or their ships or whatever, their vessels, and just got in the water, it would bring them without them barely having to paddle or do anything else. It would kind of just glide them along a certain course. When they went back and looked at the ends of these terminals, at the end of those currents, on the American side, you had small groups and settlements of Africans. This is way before Columbus. And Islam went through Africa, converting probably millions of Africans back during the Prophet Muhammad's time and shortly thereafter, which was the 600s. So you had Islam in America long before Columbus. Then on top of that, about 100 years before Columbus, Mansa Musa, who was an African emperor of Mali, he was considered the richest man, or at least one of the richest men in the world at the time. His brother brought thousands of followers to Brazil. This is in the 1300s. So there's that. Now, African slaves were bought primarily from the Ivory Coast and Mali, that area of Western Africa. So clearly, some of the slaves who were brought over were in fact Muslim. And because slaves were stripped of their original identity as a means of subjugation, so that slave masters could have more control and could cease communication between slaves, thus by thwarting any possible revolts. You did have some Islam which slipped through the cracks. And there were several organizations that came about in the early 1900s, late 1800s. Noble Drew Ali from Newark, New Jersey, who created the Moorish Science Temple way back in 1913. One of his students was someone by the name of Farad Muhammad, W. Farad Muhammad. Noble Drew Ali was eventually killed by police in Chicago, and Farad Muhammad created his own splinter organization called the Lost Foundation, and he had a pupil under him who was none other than Elijah Muhammad. There's a lot of speculation as far as W. Farad Muhammad, where he came from and who he truly was and what he was truly about. And he wound up disappearing, and Elijah Muhammad took the reins. It was renamed the Nation of Islam, and this is in the 1930s. Then in the 1950s, it wasn't very popular. It wasn't very popular. In the 1950s, a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Little joined the organization, changed his name to Malcolm X. He was a fiery debater, and he was the one that when he started to give speeches, the Nation of Islam exploded. And he was one of the most powerful speakers you ever heard in your life. On top of that, he was self-taught, taught himself in prison. He only had an 8th grade education, but a very, very intense academic. Malcolm X was. He needs no introduction. So under Malcolm X was a captain known as Clarence 13X. Clarence 13X left the Nation of Islam in 1963. He saw inconsistencies within their teachings that no one wanted to address. And then he started his own organization, which is a spin-off of the Nation of Islam, the 5% Nation. And it was different in that, as I mentioned earlier, the Nation of Islam was more so, their teachings was very racial based. Straight out racism, actually. Just to be honest, straight out racism. So he did still use their teachings, but he strived to take the racism part out of it and focus more on the scientific side of it, as well as focusing more on troubled youth. Now, Nation of Islam had already been doing that. That's how they got Malcolm X. They were recruiting from jails and things, reforming young black men, young Hispanic men. But Clarence 13X, he wanted to focus on children, like young adolescents and children, or as he called, the babies. Which is why you see that, this is the basis, by the way, of that famous award show. I think it was the Grammys, I forget. But Old Dirty Bastard stormed the stage when Diddy won an award over Wu-Tang, and he said, Puffy's good, but Wu-Tang is for the babies. Classic moment in pop culture.
I went and bought me an outfit today that costed a lot of money today. You know what I mean? Because I figured that Wu-Tang was going to win. I don't know how y'all see it, but when it comes to the children, Wu-Tang is for the children. We teach the children. You know what I mean? Puffy is good, but Wu-Tang is the best. Okay? I want y'all to know that this is ODB and I love you all. Peace.
R.I.P. Old Dirty Bastard, but that's what he was referring to. And the Wu-Tang Clan and many people in hip-hop early on, even up until recently, were involved or studied under the 5% Nation. The last guy left, I believe, is Papoose. He's the last one that I know of left that's in hip-hop that's a committed member to the 5% Nation, or the Nation of Gods and Earths. So he started the organization. That was Clarence 13X, who then wasn't known as Clarence 13X anymore. He was known as the father because he was the father of this new movement. And they have a building to this day up on 126th and 7th Avenue, which is called a school. There's also another one in Brownsville on Livonia, across the street from Van Dyke Projects. And he was killed in Harlem in Foster Projects, actually a block away from where I grew up, in 1969. So I talk about some of the views in the last video. So again, definitely want to check that out. So now let's go to my disgruntled viewer. So a couple things she said. First, she did admit that Puerto Ricans obviously played a part in the shaping of hip hop, right? So she admitted that. But then she went on to say that the 85% were dead. She mentioned that several times. I'm gonna address her. You mentioned that several times, that the 85% is dead, and you said it as if they're just a hopeless case. That is not true, because that's the whole point of the 5% Nation, or the Nation of Gods and Earth, is what? To civilize the 85%, or rather to bring them out of the darkness of blind obedience and ignorance and into the light of truth, as far as history, as far as science, as far as everything around us. One of the major premises of the 5% ethos is there are no mysteries. Everything can be explained through science. And the things that can't be explained through science, we just haven't gotten to that level of technology or of awareness yet. but that science can explain everything in existence. So therefore, the 85%, you could call them dead, in a sense they are all of them able to be helped? Maybe not. Maybe, just maybe, many of them can't be saved, can't be helped. But that doesn't mean that we stop attempting to teach them the truth. But remember, most 5% started as 85. You had some who were born into the nation, from birth their parents were in the nation, but most started as 85. The next thing I want to address is she was saying that black people can't be racist. It's impossible for a black person to be racist. That is not true either. I explained and I went into detail on the actual definition of the word racism. Now, she's saying the classic argument, which is basically black people or non-white people or minorities can't be racist because they don't have power to implement policies and things to keep other races in an inferior state. But that was actually rhetoric. That was just the talking points of a gentleman by the name of Stokely Carmichael, who was prevalent in the civil rights era and with the Black Panthers. But he was making a point, however, it doesn't add up because racism and power are two totally different things. I explained this. All racism is looking at things, viewing things, and judging things through the scope of race over everything else. It's just an ism, just like any other ism. That's all it is. It's race-ism. So it's a philosophy just based on race. It's a way of life looking at things, a philosophy just based on race. So power really has nothing to do with it. That's something Stokely Carmichael came up with, which is like, people have been using it ever since. Gotta give Stokely Carmichael credit for that. People have been using that argument ever since, but the two things are totally different. You're talking apples and oranges. So yes, a black person can be racist. If a black person lives their life, their personal philosophy, if they treat people based on the person's race, then they're a racist, regardless of what color, race, or nationality they are.